Hi, I'm Scott Hazard. I had the pleasure to sit down today with Mr. James Deere. Mr. Deere is Mineola's most established resident, and he has had his hands in projects in this town dating way, way back. I hope you enjoy our chat with Mr. Deere. I certainly did. You worked at the Select Theater your entire career?
I worked there for 58 years.
Wow. So you ought to know the Select Theater inside and out.
I do. And when I was in the service, I also run movies. I painted that sign in 1942. The reason that I painted that, see, I was working for the Select Theater, and we fixed up special fronts to attract business. When they raided Germany, and those bombs dropping, another plane was photographing all of that. So they got all of the photographs of the bombs dropping and exploding the railroad yards and everything. All this good 8x10 black and white photographs, very good. So they filmed all that and put it together for a movie. And we have an open lobby, not like it is today. The Select is open. Out by the sidewalk here, the box office sit back in here. I could build special fronts. I was a pretty good carpenter. I worked as a carpenter during the summer when I was going to high school to make enough money to stay in school. That's how I could stay in. We wasn't poor folk, we were poor. That's a colloquialism in Wood County. So I worked as a carpenter's helper, and I learned to be a pretty good carpenter. So I fixed a special front. You could buy 4x8, 4 foot wide and 8 foot long sections of what they call beaver board. It was about that thick. It was heavy material. So I took 2 of those 4x8s, fixed me a framework, put them here. And I had an opening in the middle. Between those I had that sign that said, "Hitler can't take it." And I had all those little 8x10 photographs all pasted on those sections. And you went in this way to buy your tickets. In that sign, "Hitler can't take it," after the movie was over after a few days, I had to take it all down, take all the little black and white photographs and send them back to Dallas because somebody else was going to use them. So I sent them back, saved these side pieces for future use. The sign, "Hitler can't take it," I didn't have any use for it. So I took it out the back door and just stood it up against the building for the trash people to haul off. Well, David Kitchens was running Kitchens store. And he'd come down the alley and parked right back of the Kitchens store. He saw that sign, he went up and got it. He took it in and put it on the wall. It's been there ever since.
And it's still there today.
Still there today. It's a good sign, you look at it. I learned how to write signs watching a man here who was a professional signwriter. He also worked for the railroad, but when he was laid off, he wrote signs. His name was Conley. All of his signs, he had a little brush, he put C. Conley down at the corner of his signs. Every sign he painted was straight up and down. Every letter was perfect. We had another signwriter. His name was Devers. He was a different type of signwriter. Every one of his letters had a little curve in it. The reason was he used a wand and a little ball. Put the wand against the board he was writing on and use this. And every time it come down, there was a curve. I could tell. And David Kitchens and I would talk about that. Says, yeah, you can spot every one of Devers' sign. whether he signed it or not, because it's got a slant in every letter. Conley's is perfect. He said, you're right. I bought that paint from David that painted that sign. The background is royal blue. The signed letters are silver.
So you bought the paint right there at Kitchens?
Bought it right there at Kitchen. I traded with the guy David. I'd go down there and buy stuff from him all the time. We were good friends. I was his daddy was a special man to me. That's a long story. He was good to me, good to my daddy, and all that.
What about the house that used to be behind the theater? I guess where the convenience store is now.
Okay, that was the Breen house. Breen's, Mr. Breen was the first, I don't say he was the first postmaster, but I think he was. And he had two daughters. One of them was Celestine, the other one was Lucy. The oldest one was Lucy, the other was Celestine. They worked in the post office as clerks.
Okay.
So as he got old, he resigned. Miss Lucy, those ladies were never married. They was Miss. Miss Lucy was appointed postmistress. Celestine worked as a clerk. They did that for years.
And how did that house come to get moved? Was that
Okay, the
house
house
moved or
there
was it torn
was an
down?
old original house built in the early days of Mineola. So the Breens thought, well, that house would make a good museum. So they give it to the city of Mineola to be a museum. The fire marshal and fire chief was Buster Mills. And I went out the back door of the theater and Buster was standing there in the alley looking at that old house. He said, Abe, I'm telling you what. The old house was standing there, it was right out, and been there for years. The paint was worn off of it. He said, if that ever catches fire, we're gonna lose half of Mineola business. Cause it'd be one of the hottest fires in town, and we can't keep enough water on these buildings to keep them from catching fire. It's gonna have to go. So there was a lot of controversy over that, in Mineola, about tearing the old building down. It would not be suited for a museum in the first place. So they tore it down. A lot of people objected to it, but it's a precaution to keep from the buildings from catching fire. So extreme heat will explode other buildings and other fire departments. So it had to go. And that's when the little convenience store was put there, and they called it a 7-Eleven. Open in the morning at 7 and stayed open till 11 at night. That's why they call them 7-Eleven stores. Magnolia House. At one time was owned by Judge Hart. And his wife, future wife, was married. Now I'm going to get myself there. Her first husband was Dr. Noble, become Dr. Noble. And then her daughter, after she married Hart, become Polly, Polly Hart. Dr. Noble never lived in that house there. He went to live with John Rucker. And as he matured and got to be a doctor, he had a house, built a house directly across from John Rucker's. Chris Molyneux lived with John Rucker. Reuben Rucker, John Rucker's nephew, lived with him. He raised those boys. His wife was named Nam Rucker.
And who was John Rucker? Who was Mr. Rucker? What did?
John Rucker was Mr. Rucker. John Rucker started off in the lumber business. He had south of the railroad track, across from the lumber company there, there used to be a hotel there. That was the Bailey Hotel. Before Bailey Hotel was built, John Rucker had a railroad boarding house. And Chris Molyneux, a little 9-year-old boy, run errands for him. My daddy run a meat market on Commerce Street there by the hotel.
And that's the boarding house is where the train workers would stay, the railroad workers would
They'd
stay?
eat there, yeah. He fed them.
Okay.
So later on, he sold the property and they built the bank. They dismantled the old boarding house and built the Bailey Hotel, which then got to be later on the Carlton Hotel, and then it got to be another business there, I have to think a bit about that. But anyhow, that was a big hotel and a very nice hotel when it was built. It had a historical marker there. Of course, when the hotel went out of business, they lost the marker.
Polly
Polly Peterson?
was, as I understand it, she was one of the first women in Wood County to get a driver's license. Is that right?
That's possible as it was, because, see, her name was, I tell you, she was Polly Hart before she married Dr.
Right.
Peterson. And the doctors are the first ones in Mineola to have automobiles. So it's possible she's one of the first to get a driver's license.
I read that somewhere, that she was one of the first women in the county to get a driver's
Possible.
license.
Driver's license, you didn't have to have a Texas driver's license for a long time. I was one of the first to get a Texas driver's license.
Oh, were you?
Yes. I was 15 years old at the time.
What was required for you to get a Texas driver's license?
You laugh at this. W.D. Williams had a grocery store. And Beulah Russell, who later married, she was married for her first husband. She had a son, C.W. Russell, you know, the same age at school. And she worked for her uncle, which was W.D. Williams. So when they said everybody's going to have a driver's license, and the word got around, if you go down there to the W.D. Williams store, all you got to do is tell them you know how to drive a car, and he'll give you a license. So a bunch of us went down there, and we went in, and Miss Beulah was behind the counter. Said, "Can we get a driver's license so you can drive a car?" I said, "I can drive a Model T Ford." Uncle had one. Okay, fill this out. So we filled them out, we got a license.
And that was just all there was to it?
Yes, sir, that's all there was to it. And I had it renewed when we had to have them renewed. When I was in the Army, I had what we call a GI license. I took a driver's test, rode the motor sergeant from Castellana, Italy to Bari, Italy, and back, and to go up there on business. He wrote me out a driver's license. That was it. That's the only driver's license test that I took for years and years and years.
And back in those days, Saturdays were quite a big day in town, were they?
Mineola was a Saturday town. We had lots of people, farmers, lots of people out in the country that worked at sawmills. And on a Saturday, that was a big day. To go to Mineola to shop, spend the day, go to the Leroy Theater, and after you saw that, go down there to Rory Humphrey's hamburger stand or the Patrick's hamburger stand, and you get a big hamburger for 10 cents and a Coke for a nickel. That's true. And then go to the Select Theater for the show that was starting over there at 2 o'clock. See that movie. If you'd come from Pine Mills to Mineola, Schamberger's little store down in Pine Mills, there'd be a flatbed truck parked there. If you're going to Mineola, sit down on that truck, feet hanging off, get a ride to Mineola, and get off there at the post office, which is now the museum. And you're in town. And at 5 o'clock, you were supposed to be there and catch your ride back to the country, back to Pine Mills. And I'm trying to think here. Dan Henderson, that has a Mineola Packing Company, he missed his ride one time. He had to walk all the way home.
All the way back to Pine Mills?
Yeah, 15 miles or so.
That's a long walk.
Well, it wasn't quite to Pine Mills. It was on that road that turns off the Haynesville Road and goes by the cemetery down there. Well, their home was on that road. So we walked there and got off the Haynesville Road and get home.
The Select Theater played different movies every day with Bank Night on Tuesday. Tell us a little bit about what Bank Night was.
Well, in order to create business and interest in going to the movies, we're going to have Bank Night. People would sign tickets. We had a hopper there. You drop your tickets in there. We didn't change those tickets. Just added to. And it made it more interesting. And you could pull a card out, John Jones, we're not there. So you put it back in.
So you had to be there to win.
Had to be there to win. Be in the theater. In the afternoon, if you wanted to go to the afternoon show, you could sign an afternoon book that you was here in the afternoon, you were still eligible. If you went in the afternoon. We had some people who won like that. We started off at $25. Now, $25 is not much today, but in those days, it was pretty good money.
What years was this going on?
Back in the 30s.
Okay.
Then we, the next week we added more, another $25 with it. So the next week would be $50. And then if nobody was claiming the money, the next week it was $75. Boy, that's getting interesting. And you increase your business. And next week is $100. And then if somebody won the $100, you started over at 25. But after it built up to 100, we'll say, or 125, interest began to lag a little bit. Advertised and announced that night. The next week we're going to give away. We're going to draw till somebody gets $25. That sweetened up the pot. And this time went on, we get up to about $400 or $500. That's pretty good, boy. You have a house full in the afternoon. If somebody win that, well, he was back down to $25. That went on for a number of years. It started off with Bank Night. And then the government says that's illegal. So we had to discontinue Bank Night. But then the government changed. It says that money if you give away will be taxable, 20%. In other words, if somebody won $100, $20 went to the government. You had to do that and fill out the papers and all of this. So as long as you paid tax, it was legal. So we had to change it from Bank Night to Purse Night. So that went on for a number of years, and business began to pick up, and interest lagged, so we give it the last, we drew to give away the last money that we had built up. Everybody was happy.
And what was the most that you ever remember giving away on one of those?
I think it was 500.
In the 1930s, $500 was a lot of money.
It was a lot of money, yeah.
And what did most people make it in a month at that point?
All right. Back in the Depression days, common labor, whatever you could get, if you could get a job, was 15 cents an hour for a 10-hour day. That's $1.50. In the summer, if I could get a job, carpentering, whatever, I was getting $1.50 a day. Plus, I was still working at the theater on weekends. I was making $3.50. I was making as much money as a man that had a wife and 3 kids. Times were hard then.
Right.
And we talk about the recession now. The depression went on for a number of years. So my daddy died when I was 7. And we moved to town. We lived out on 37 at the time in a house that belonged to Dave Kitchens, the old gentleman. My daddy had been hurt. A horse fell on him as a result. They had to drive the cattle to the dipping vat because they had the Rocky Mountain spotted tick fever. The government says all cattle's got to be dipped. He had a job as foreman of a ranch owned by the First National Bank of Mineola. And where all the cattle come from, a lot of people, the farmers would borrow some money to make a crop. He might put up 10 head of cattle, 2 hogs or 4 hogs, team of mules. He borrowed the money to make a crop. In the fall of the year, after he sold his cotton and gathered his corn, and come time he didn't have enough money, then the cattle, the hogs, the mules had to be repossessed. So Will Ray was an old ex-sheriff, and he was a repossessing agent. So he would have to go out, and they'd herd these cattle up and drive them down there, and then my daddy and a bunch of Mexicans, they wasn't called Hispanics, they was called Mexicans in those days. And they had a bunch of crew to help him. They had to brand all those cattle with the Manx brand before they could turn them loose in the bottom. It was open range in those days.
Right.
Lake Fork Creek bottom was all open for miles. The bank had some title to some property. It was the headquarters now. We lived in one of their houses. So then they turned them loose up on the range. And Will Ray had a horse called Old Bum. He was a trained cow horse. You've seen these cutting horses, how they work. Well, he would, I remember one of the Donegal men, which is older than I was, said if you got a chance to ride Old Bum, it was an honor. It was something to be able to ride him. Will Ray'd say, boy, get on Old Bum and go bring that little herd of cattle in. And he said, you ride with a slack reins. Give him his head. He'll bring the cattle in. And you got on him and head him to the cattle, and he would herd them up and bring them into the corral. But he was a rough riding horse. My dad had a big black horse. It was easy riding. So Will Ray was having some appendix trouble. He said, ride my horse and I'll ride Old Bum. It'll be easier on you. So they had this herd of cattle going from Lake Fork Bottom up to what we call the Howard Road out there. And they had a dipping vat there, a gin, feed mill, that was run by Mr. Spades, Homer Spades. So that's where we're going, they dip the cattle. A young bull cut away from the herd was going back to the pasture. So Mom turned and run to hurt him. And as he turned to crowd the bull around to head him back, the bull turned and went over and threw him off, and the horse fell on him. So he was not able to, he got up, got on the horse, went on and drove the cattle. He didn't know he was hurt internally, but he was. So he was not able to do manual labor anymore, so he had to resign that job. He worked a while in Rockfall Lake as a seeing after the lake for the club. So Dave Kitchens told me, Daddy, if you'll move on my farm out north of Mineola out there, what was known as Equipment Road is 37 now. They live in the house. I buy mules in the fall of the year that people have to turn them back, and they sell the mules, I buy them, then sell them in the spring. And I'll put alfalfa hay in that barn, and you see that to feed my mules. You know, right? So we moved to his house out there.
And he was the overseer of all of that.
And he was overseer of his farm and ranch operation. So Mr. Kitchen said, James, I was 6 years old at the time, he said, I'll bring you some gopher traps out here. I want you to catch them gophers out in my farmland out here. I'll give you 5 cents for every gopher you catch. And so my daddy could do taxidermist work, so he would skin the gophers, stretch the hides, and stamp them up. So Mr. Kitchen would come out on Saturday morning and say, well, how many gophers did you catch? I said, right here. And this is the skins. Well, you count them. I got a nickel for the skin and a nickel for the gopher. I was getting 10 cents for every gopher I caught. Boy, I had me a business going. He would take them down to the store because the hide buyers would come, hide buyers, fur buyers, whatever. They would come on Saturday. A lot of the farmers and ranchers would bring in, they'd trap, bring in coon skins and possum skins and coyote skins, bobcat skins and all. They had them all skinned and stretched. They would buy them from them. So that's where Mr. Kitchens would sell that, and that was a good deal to bring all the farmers and the buyers into his store. So Mr. Kitchens, of course, after my daddy died, after 2 years, we moved into town. My uncle was not married at the time. My grandmother lived with him. So we moved in, and the lady was taking care of the house and my grandmother. She could get another job, which she knew they were a problem getting in, so she went to work for Mr. and Ms. Vanderford. Ms. Vanderford ended, and she took care of her. So we lived on that with my uncle. And that time I was 7 years old. That was 1923.
What did people do with gopher skins?
They used them to line gloves with. There was a demand for gloves. They sent them north, and they made gloves out of them, and they lined them with gopher skins. They're very soft, very warm.
Mineola went dry when Prohibition came around. I mean, the sale of alcohol was banned. Do you remember anything prior to that, or do you have any secondhand knowledge?
Okay, I'll tell you this. I knew a man, a young fellow down in Nacogdoches, teaches biology. He was born and raised in Mineola. Back before Prohibition, alcohol was legal. This young fella has got a top-type jug, and when you hold it up on the bottom, it said Dave Kitchens Fine Whiskey. It was bought by the jugs. You could sell it over the counter anywhere. Mineola had saloons. There was saloons everywhere. Mineola, I think, one time had 4 saloons. The old folks tell me. So we had these saloons. Well, a lot of the ladies in Mineola was upset because their husbands would go down and get a little too drunk. So they decided they would have a temperance league. They formed a temperance league. And they had marches in Mineola, down with barleycorn, down with alcohol. And I'll tell you this, and I think it should be told. There was a fellow by Lorenzo Calloway. He was just a little fella. He was small for his age, so they called him Buckshot. Buckshot Calloway. And he was carrying the placard down with alcohol. And he was singing the song, "Come to Jesus, come to Jesus." So the Langford brothers, 3 of them, they were older than him, but there were also his cousins. Dallas Langford, Will Langford, and Harry Langford. This was told to me by Buck Epps, the old projectionist select theater. He's quite a bit older than I was. So the Langford boys was poking fun and calling little Buckshot a little sissy. You got to march with the women and all of these things, and poking fun at him and laughing at him. So little Buckshot was walking along, they said, with his placard, and he was singing, "Come to Jesus, come to Jesus, come to Jesus, go to hell, you SOBs, come to Jesus, come to Jesus." So that was little Buckshot. Anyhow, alcohol was voted out of Mineola. The saloons were closed, but do you want me to tell you about the shootout on South Johnson?
Well, I'm just curious, when alcohol was voted out, when prohibition came to be and alcohol was no longer, certainly that wasn't the end of alcohol. That just added a criminal element to alcohol, am I right?
You see, up north they opened illegal saloons called speakeasies.
Right.
Down south they called them blind tigers. So Mineola had a blind tiger at 116 South Johnson Street. And the Temperance League got wind of it, and their husbands are still finding a place to go get some alcohol, still coming home pretty well healed, and so they reported it to the authorities. So they sent a man to Mineola to close it down. He was a lawman. I'm trying to think what they called him then. They called him a revenue officer. That's what they called him, a revenue officer, because that was not collecting tax, which was revenue. That's the way it was. So the revenue officer, they got wind there was going to be a revenue officer in to close down the Blind Tiger. So a group of men began to collect down on South Johnson Street. 116's on the east side, the west side. So we had a city marshal with the name of Tillman Cage. He was a very good lawman, very well liked. Now this come to me from my uncle, also from a man by the name of Frank Molyneux. So he had got wind that there was going to be a shootout down there. So he rushed down there. He was going to try to stop the shootout. But the revenue officer got there just ahead of it. So the shooting started. The revenue officer was shot and killed. The city marshal, Tillman Cage, was shot and killed. At 113 South Johnson, that's on the east side of the street, just above the alley over there at the angle. And the story is that Dave Kitchens had a hardware store there at the time, and he stepped out front to see what the shooting was about. I mean, what the gathering was about. And the shooting started, and he turned to go back in the store, and he got caught in the back with a stray bullet. Lodged so close to the spine that they could not do surgery. His son David told me that he lived for many, many years with that bullet next to his spine. He died with it there. But the Blind Tiger naturally had to go out of business. There was an investigation of it, and Mr. Kitchens, they thought he had something to do with it. They took him to trial. He was acquitted. They couldn't prove it. He didn't have anything to do with it. He was just an innocent bystander that got shot in the back. Now, I own that pistol.
Oh, do you really?
You know, it's a .32 Smith & Wesson. It's a very unusual gun.
The pistol that shot him?
The shot the revenue officer.
Oh, that shot the revenue officer.
I got that gun. I inherited it from my uncle. He never would tell me who the man had it. But he said they killed 5 men. I still have the gun. And it was a very unusual gun. They only made about 1,000 or so of them in around the year 1900. They made 3 models: a long barrel, a medium barrel, and a short barrel. I have the medium barrel. It's a very unusual gun. It had a special feature of it. So when my uncle died, well, my aunt says go up to my house. She was in a rest all the time, and I was the power of attorney. Go up to my house, in the back room. There's a little two-drawer chest there. In the top drawer is your uncle's pistol. He'd want you to have it. I want you to have it. His gold watch and chain is in the lockbox at the back. I want you to have that. You go down there, you have the key, you get it. So, I got that. This is his walking stick.
Oh, really?
Well over 100 years old. He lived to be 99 and a half years.
So that runs in your family, huh?
Yes. I have a sister that is 97.
And how old are you?
Rest home over at Lindale. I'm 94.
You're 94. Wow.
My brother died in 94. My mother died in 94. I'm still hanging around. I guess for doing what I'm supposed to do with you.
Mineola was a big train town. There were a lot of railroad employees here, and the train played a very big part of Mineola. Can you tell me a little bit about those days?
Well, at first it wasn't a railroad. Mineola was just a community, known as Sodom, according to the old-timers. But the Texas and Pacific was running a railroad from the east going west. The International Great Northern was down in East Texas along about Palestine, and it was set up down there, and it was coming to north towards Mineola. They said it was kind of a contest to see who was going to get here first. Whoever got here first at a certain marking would be the controlled the depot. So there was kind of a contest who's going to get here first. I understand that the International Great Northern, which is called the IGN or called the Jenny, it had, I believe, criminal convict labor They used to do that. The convicts were building the railroad. The Texas Pacific had professional builders hiring crews. Of course, they got to level the ground, lay the ties. Mineola, Wood County had lots of trees, so they had lots of trees cut to make cross ties. They cut them with cross-cut saws, hacked them out with broad axes. Then you put them in the ground and laid the rails on them. So we come down to the showdown, and they had a marker where it was supposed to be. And the story is that the convicts lined up on each side of the rails and picked them up and carried them and dropped them down. So they got here first. That's the story. I don't know how true it is. But anyhow, the IGN did control the depot. So there was first there was a depot that had, now these are told to me by the old timers. The depot had 2 floors. It had actually a ground floor and 2 floors above, which it had quarters there where people could sleep. And this is like a hotel. And they bought the tickets down here, whatever they come in, if they wanted to have to spend the night somewhere, they could spend there. But the first one burned, so they built another one. Not as elaborate, I understand. And it didn't burn. So they built what you see there now. But it didn't look like that now. It had another additional overhang on the east side that covered where they had those freight wagons that they stored under there.
Right.
At the other end was the Railway Express Agency. A lot of people don't even know there was an express agency, but there was. It was a Railway Express Agency. It was a building there. And across Johnson Street was a freight depot. And a lot of the communications was done at the freight depot through telegraph.
Right.
And all of the business was transacted in the office at the depot down near the east end. We didn't have anything else. So the railroad's ended in Mineola. Now, that's what they call it's where they could run an engine on and call it a turntable, and you could turn that around and turn that engine around, and on the IGN it had a Y. You could turn the engine around and it went on the Y to the main line and back up and hook on to the other end of the train and go on south. The MK&T come in later. The Katy, they called it, the MK&T, Missouri, Kansas, and Texas. Come out of Missouri, across Kansas, across the panhandle of Oklahoma, on down to Wichita Falls, on down to Greenville, on down to Mineola. And before it got to Mineola, it had a parallel track. So it come to Mineola, that was the end of the MK&T. So to send the train back, it had passenger train and also freight cars. So they could go across Pacific Street and get on the turntable and turn around and get back on the parallel track going west. Went about a mile out there, had a switch, come back onto the engine, come back onto this main line, backed up, caught the end of that, went on back, on up to Greenville, on that way. So, then later on, about completed in 1929, they said we're gonna move the roundhouse from Longview to Mineola. So they built roundhouse west of Mineola, a couple of miles west, where they could service engines and do repair work on them, it had a turntable in it where you could turn the engines around. So you turn one in there, and then you could, that was the headquarters. They had to pay the people, the railroad men, the union required them to pay, buy the houses and pay them railroad people because they had to relocate in Mineola. So a lot of the people in Mineola, at that time, there was not enough hotel rooms for them to stay, so a lot of people rented rooms to railroad men. And a lot of them moved the family up if it was a big enough house. A lot of people made a lot of arrangements to accommodate the railroad people because it's good for Mineola. So then west of the Mineola Country Club, that was Zed English's farm. So he could see the opportunity there, so he divided his farm up into streets and lots. And they started building houses out there for railroad men. And they also built a hotel near the roundhouse, but it was not successful. It was a two-story, nice hotel with a restaurant. But the railroad men wouldn't stay there. They wanted to come to Mineola where they could go see a movie and visit around town and so forth. And so we had transportation, taxis that would go out and pick them up, bring them to Mineola. They stay at different places. And a lot of the men, but they lived in Mineola, and a lot of them lived out west of town there. So the railroads was doing big business. We had lots of farmers in those days. We had a farmer's market out near the roundhouse. They would carry truckloads of watermelons, and they would ship them out by rail. They had melon buyers, and they'd ship them up north. And we also had contract buyers of roasting ears, corn, and they would buy a carload of corn put on these boxcars. But we also had an ice plant on Front Street with overhead troughs, and you could put these 300-pound block of ice on that, and it went by gravity all across over the railroad track the way they spot these cars. And two men would be there with ice picks, and they had a carload of roasting ears going up to Philadelphia. They had to have ice in there to keep the corn from going through a heat. So they chopped up chunks of ice and dropped them down through openings on top of those boxcars. They were called refrigerator cars. And you drop the ice down in there. And they pulled it out. Here come another big chunks of ice, and they dumped it down there. The ice plant went day and night molding those big 300-pound blocks of ice.
And that kept the corn cool on
Kept
the way
the
up.
corn
on the
cool.
way
If
up
they
north.
had a load of cabbage coming in from the valley, it'd be an ice down there, and it needed to be re-iced. They spotted it to Mineola to re-ice it. You know, Mineola was a busy place.
So the railroad really kind of changed the whole complexion of Mineola, didn't it?
It did. It was good. It brought the radio, all of the radio personnel. They traded in Mineola. It was another industry coming in because they bought the groceries, bought all the clothing. Everything was downtown Mineola. Big business in Mineola. It went on that way for years and years. The contract with the union to the railroad employees that this would never move the roundhouse out of Mineola. They got that in the contract when they had to pay off these people. And they said, we'll never move it from Mineola. They didn't. They discontinued it. That's smart business, big attorneys, So Mineola, then trains went through Mineola, just like this, come back through Mineola the other way. We didn't have the shipping out of Mineola. At one time, as I talked about the coast ties, there was a railroad spur on the south side of Mineola over there, south of Mineola Railroad, where they had a tie yard. And they would buy these cross ties, which they got to where they was making cross ties with saws. They was all sawed out. The man could make a lot of cross ties with the power saws. They had two black men, I watched them load cross ties. They pick a cross tie up on the end, lean over, put the balance on his shoulder, walk up two 2x12s up into the box car. You see them go out of sight, wham! That old box car would shake like that. They just dropped that off on the floor. Those men had what they call a pone on his shoulder like this. And the man that was, black man that worked for the theater for 33 years, his brother, Lonzo, was one of the men that called him. He says when they first started off, they put a pad up here. As time goes on, that builds up a big old pone there on his shoulder, and he don't have to have a pad. That cross tie rides on that pone. They made good money loading cross ties. It wasn't everybody could do that.
So there was a little bit of work for everybody
Shipped
there.
them out to where there was a creosoting plant, so they could creosote those cross ties,
Right.
so they would last for years and years. All of them had to be creosoted, so they had to ship them to a creosote plant, so they shipped them out of Mineola.
What about major crimes that have happened over the years in Mineola? And this is kind of a morbid subject, but you've certainly seen some of that kind
Well,
of stuff.
Mineola at one time was pretty much of a wide open town. You talked about the alcohol. Well, I don't know how all this is gonna come out, but they wanna get local option, and right now they're have some, gonna have an election to sell alcohol in restaurants and take home and so forth. So after Prohibition, then they decided they could have local option elections and have alcohol. So Mineola had a local option election and had some alcohol outside of the city limits. So west of town, and also south of town, and also east of town, and only one north of town, where they could sell 3-2 beer. That's 3 and 2% alcohol. So there was a lot of places went into business, and they called them honky-tonks. They all had a place where you go in and short order restaurant, dance floor, buy your 3-2 beer, sit around, drink beer, and do all of that. Also, some of those fellas would sell you a pint or a gallon of illegal corn whiskey. I mean, it was going on that much. I remember my uncle built a nice location and built a nice house on it, and he leased it out. Man lived in the house, part of the deal. He had his restaurant, dance floor, and that man would also sell you a gallon of corn whiskey if you wanted to buy it. There were a lot of places sold different amounts of alcohol. And I remember there was a fellow by the name of Jess Seibert, and he talked to me later on after he'd out of the business, and he had a little country store out there on what is old Highway 80 now. And Arthur Judge, who's deputy sheriff right now, he'll tell you this, that they live right nearby from the Judge property. his name was Walter Judge. He says, Mr. Seibert had a pet coon, and his sister was Mary. Said we'd go up there and play with that pet coon. We'd get on the floor and play with him. He'd just rattle with us and all that. We have a good time. Miss Seibert was sitting over there in a rocking chair. Somebody come in and say, well, I believe I want fish for supper tonight. I said, all right. He'd get up and go behind his deli counter where he had all kinds of lunch meat and cheese and eggs and milk and stuff like that. He had a place down in under there he could open up, and he'd get one of the fish out. It was already wrapped and lay it on the counter. The man would pay him, pick up his fish and leave. He says, I got a little older and I got to noticing that all them fish was the same size and already wrapped up. And I figured out later on, as I got older, that was whiskey. And so Jess told me, he said, they'd come out and raid me, but they never found any whiskey. Says, you know where I had my whiskey stored? I said, I have no idea. He said, well, I went through a barbed wire fence over there on Mr. Judge's place. They never looked on Mr. Judge's place. That's where I had my whiskey hid out. And I sold whiskey there for years. So whiskey was illegal at that time. And Mineola had fightings, knifings, shootings out there. They had prostitutes. And I remember the jail went across the alley behind the Leroy Theater. And we went down to clean the theater one morning. We opened the back doors, and there's a fellow standing there, two of them. Says the jail is full of prostitutes. They had a raid that night, picked up all the prostitutes and brought them in and locked them in the jails. They would go out and they found illegal whiskey, illegal prostitution going on. They would put padlocks on all of the honky-tonks. That didn't stop it. The next day, they opened under new management. And I remember after you went across the Katy Crossing, Highway 80 used to go across the Crater Railroad crosses at West Town. On that side, they had the Black Cat Inn. Across the road was Tomcat Inn. It had one just like it. The man that run the Black Cat Inn was Manuel Humphrey. And he got the nickname as Black Cat Humphrey. He run that for a while till the liquor was voted out. And they said, well, the bootleggers and the church people voted out 3-2 beer. Said we could go back and have a free hand and selling the bootleg whiskey.
Right.
And a lot of that went on, but there was a lot of crime out there. And I remember there was one fella, he was pretty much of pull a knife on people. And he pulled a knife on the constable and he shot him. Killed him. These other people were shot. And one man said, well, my brother is crazy. He's crazier than I am. He's got a couple of fellas. He played at insanity. So he got off on insanity. So he's got paper to prove he's crazy. I don't have that kind of paper. I'm just ordinary crazy. Anyhow, the alcohol was voted out. There's no more beer. All of the honky-tonks finally closed. They had one dance floor out there I'll tell you about. Fred Chapel had that dance floor. It was a big dance floor. Open air. And the East Texas Serenaders, you might have heard them. They've got a right up in the museum. And one of their sons is still living down in Pine Mills. I know him well. He was featured in the Monitor. And his name is Pat Bogan. And his daddy was also Pat Bogan, and he was a member of the East Texas Serenaders. And they played in a lot of those dances out there. And this dance floor was open air. It was in a grove of post oak trees. Post oak acorns would fall on the dance floor. They didn't bother to sweep them off, so it got to be called the acorn stomping. Fellows older than me said, "Well, you going to acorn stomping tonight?" "Oh yeah, I'm going, I'll be out there." And he would either furnish a girl to dance with you, or you bring your own girl. You went up 3 steps onto this big dance floor, which is about 50 foot wide or so. It was more of a circle. And over the corners where the East Texas Serenaders or any other string band would play. So they called it acorn stomping because they stomp on the acorns and pulverize them down. But the East Texas Serenaders, it was in the 20s and 30s, late 20s, early 30s. So their music was different. Some of their recordings are in the Smithsonian Institute because their recordings were from the old folk music up to what they call Western swing. Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys was credited with Western swing.
Right.
And he was acquainted with the East Texas Serenaders. And East Texas Serenaders, their music was so different and so unique that the Smithsonian wanted some of their recordings. And Pat Bogan, after the East Texas Serenaders was disbanded, they had a man with them that could write music, and they could all read music. All of their music was vocal. There was no, was instrumental. There was no vocals with it. So they had to play music. And it was unusual because it was different from the old folk music. Okay, Leon Payne was born on a little community known as Grit. I don't tell you all about Grit. I don't know all about Grit, but they had a feud up there, and I think they killed both families. It's just a sign on the side of the road that says Grit. Well, Grit was born, where is near the Rhine. Some lady took him under her wing and taught him how to play the guitar and how to sing and how to read Braille. And she did a lot for Leon. So Leon got to where that he was writing music and playing music. And one of his songs, which was very popular, is "I Love You Just Because You're You." Sold millions of records. He appeared at the Grand Ole Opry. He's in the Music Hall of Fame. The University of Texas at Austin published a book several years ago. I don't know how Jack Rhodes got overlooked in that, but he's not in it. But Leon Payne is in it. And he's dressed in his Western uniform with his Western hat. And he was married to a blind lady, and he carried one of those indicator sticks that tell where your steps are. And he would come to the Select Theater to watch Roy Rogers and Gene Autry pictures because he was learning how to present, how to sing, and how to make him more familiar with their songs and everything. So he recorded a number of songs, and he was very popular. And there was a lot of the East Texas Serenaders are also in that book. And Buddy Holly's in it, a lot of them. I had a cousin who was George Atwood, and he played and Buddy Holly's band at one time. And so Buddy Holly called him to come to Lubbock. He wanted to talk to him, so he went. He says, "George, this is my last tour. I'm going on. I'm tired. I don't want to travel anymore. And when I get back after this trip, I want to put in a recording studio, and I want you to be a partner with me." I said, "All right." Buddy and the bebopper and another fellow, they went on that plane to that thing, and he was killed.
That's the day the music died.
That's what he died. Well, his cousin of mine played the bass fiddle with him. And I'll tell you about Pat Bogan. He played the bass fiddle with the East Texas Serenaders, but the fiddle was so big he couldn't get it in the car. Took that cello, and he strung it like a bass fiddle. He could get it in the car. So that's what he played. And one of the musicians played the fiddle, had a left-handed fiddle. And that's something to see a man play a fiddle left-handed. But when he was a kid, he slipped out his daddy's fiddle and was playing it. He learned how to play it right-handed. But his daddy caught him, and he was playing his fiddle. So he said, "Well, all right, I'll get you a fiddle and we'll string it left-handed." He did, make him a left-handed fiddle. So that's how he grew up, and he writing music for the East Texas Serenaders.
What about the days of Bonnie and Clyde? Was it Bonnie and Clyde were said to have been at least through here at some point, so tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, Bonnie and Clyde would come through Mineola, going east. One day they stopped. There's a little building there just east of the old Henry Hotel. It was a Humble station, or Exxon station. And they were in there buying gas. And E.W. Jennings was a deaf mute. And he had a shoe shop in the next block east. And he was standing out in front. There wasn't any customers. It was in the morning pretty early, and he was just standing there. And there was a car left that station and go by, and he was hollering, and he could make a racket, but he couldn't talk. And waving his hands, somebody was, "Well, what's run up to him?" He had his little pad. And Bonnie and Clyde bought gasoline that morning and left going east. One night, the old Eat Shop Cafe was where the hamburger place is on Broad Street going east there. Hamburger.
Burger Company.
Burger, whatever it is. So there was a man eating supper in there. He recognized Bonnie and Clyde sitting there eating. So he finished his meal and went up and paid and left. And Will Ray was the city marshal. He was an old retired sheriff, and he worked as a city marshal. And he went out looking for him, and he found Will Ray. He says, "Mr. Ray, Bonnie and Clyde are eating at the East Shop Cafe." He said, "What do you want me to do about it?" He says, "Go arrest them." He says, "I can't do that." He said, "Well, why not?" He said, "Well, they have said they'll never be caught alive, never be captured alive. If I went in there to arrest them, I would have to shoot them or they'd shoot me. If that happened, there would be other people in there who would get hurt, be a lot of bullets flying around. Other innocent people might get hurt." Said, "So I can't go in there and arrest them." He says, "Is there a car sitting out in front with a man sitting in it?" He says, "Yeah, I noticed a man sitting in the car there." He said, "That's probably Machine Gun Kelly. I understand he's riding with them now. If I went in there and I was lucky enough to kill Bonnie and Clyde and I come out, Machine Gun Kelly was sitting there with a machine gun, he'd get me." So a lot of people get shot. I would get shot. So it's better just leave them alone. Let them finish their meal, and they'll drive on east. That's where they're going. They've been seen down that way, all the way into Louisiana. So don't bother with them, just leave them alone. So they went through. Now somebody said, well, that they held up a bank in Mineola. That was in Mineola, Texas. I understand it was Mineola, Kansas, that they did. Now they were very brutal, cruel people. My brother-in-law was from Arkansas. He and my sister had been up there visiting relatives, and they were coming back, and they stopped at the country store. And the old man and old lady in the country store, and the old man's face was all beat up. And he stopped there to get some gasoline. He said, what happened to you? He said, Bonnie and Clyde been here, and they robbed me, and they beat me up. And left. So that's kind of people they were. They were not Robin Hood people. They were criminals. They robbed banks, stores, and all that.
Some of the stories you hear kind of hold them up to be almost good guys.
Yes, but they were not. They were criminals. And there was a movie made, Bonnie and Clyde. It was one of our biggest grossing pictures.
At the Select?
At the Select. We would sell out. We run afternoon shows. We'd sell out in the afternoon, sell out at night. My brother and his wife had come from California to visit. That night, he'd come up to the theater there. The theater was full. I was selling tickets, but people was lined up around the block. And he'd come up. Most of it, I let him in the side door. He says, what's going on? I said, Bonnie and Clyde. He said, we had to park down there by the railroad. There's no parking places in town. It's people lining up all the way down around the corner. I said, I know it. They want to see Bonnie and Clyde. Well, we run the movie. It was very successful. And then Bonnie and Clyde were killed down near Louisiana down there. They were set up. And they were shot and killed. The bodies were carried to Dallas. They were originally from Dallas. They were going to have a funeral at the church up there, and it had a front porch on it. The caskets of Bonnie and Clyde were placed on the front porch. We had newsreels in those days by several different companies, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, Paramount. All had newsreels. We run them every week. Wasn't any television, but people like to see the newsreels and see what's going on. So there was a newsreel cameraman photographing the people going by, looking at Bonnie and Clyde in the caskets. There was a couple from Mineola went by. So people come from everywhere to see Bonnie and Clyde,
Right.
even in their death.
Let's talk one final thing. Let's talk about the Meredith Foundation. I've been living here for 4 years, and it seems to me like the Meredith Foundation has just almost built this town. The Meredith Foundation has really, really, really done a lot for this town. Let's talk a little bit about how that was started and
Okay,
how
all
it's
right,
progressed.
I'll tell you that. Harry Meredith come to Mineola in 1908 to help establish the Mineola State Bank. We had the First National Bank on the corner where the chamber office is now. The little building next to it, they set up in there. So things started working good. So across the street on the corner there of Broad and Johnson Street, on the west corner there, that's where the old Casper Opera House was. And what happened there, it had a store down beneath it. So it was vacant, and they stocked it with shoes and clothes. And Howard Lott was a young man selling insurance, so he sold them a fire insurance policy on it. went across to the bank, put his check in the bank, and said, I ran a good day today. He said, I sold insurance on that new dry goods store that's going over there. The man in there said they're gonna burn it. He said, no, they wouldn't burn it, no. He said, yes, they'll burn it. He said, what makes you think they'll burn it? He says, when out-of-town people find a small town with a vacant building, and they stock that with a bunch of old bankrupt stock they bought 10 cents on the dollar, and insure it, they'll burn it. He said, sure enough they did. They burned it. But it wasn't a successful burn. But the Mineola Fire Department got down there and broke the door in and went in and put the fire out. We heard the fire alarm at night, and my brother said, let's go down there in the morning and see what burned. So we went down the next morning before school. Fire truck's still in the street and the hose still in the street. So we went on to school, and a man was 10 years older than I was. I was just a little kid. I was about 1923. So he was several years older. And him and some other fellas went in looking around. And on the west wall, looked like shoes from the floor to the ceiling on the shelf. And they were just smoked up, the boxes. They pulled one out. It's empty. All the boxes were empty. They bought bankrupt stock, took the shoes out, stocked it with empty boxes and set it on fire. Well, anyhow, the old Casper Opera House had also had a little tornado damage. So it was unsafe. So they tore it down, and the Mineola State Bank bought the lot, built that building on the corner and the building next to it and the building back of it. So they moved in there. That was in the 30s. And banks were closing in a lot of places. Depression was on. So the directors of both banks got together, and they decided if we have one bank, we may survive. So we had a man here, a lawyer, with the name of Malcolm Landers. So he engineered the transfer of all assets and liabilities of the Mineola State Bank to the First National Bank. So Harry Meredith was president of Mineola State, so he moved over to the First National, and he was elected chairman of the board. So everything was going good. They survived. Banking got to where it was good. Harry Meredith had some money. He invested some oil royalties down at the Hawkins Field, which is coming in good. Brought in some wells on his interest. So he began to get pretty wealthy. And he built that house north of the First Baptist Church up there, that nice 2-story house. That's where Dr. Knight lives now. He built that house. And directly east of it, back of his house, was the McDaniel property. Mr. McDaniel had died, and that big lot was up for sale. So J.C. Judge was a wealthy man, had a lot of holdings and stuff, and he was a good friend of Harry Meredith, and he says, Harry, if I buy that lot back of your house here, will you build a library on it? Mineola needs a library. He said, well, I might. He said, all right, I'll buy that, and I'll need it as a library location. He said, all right. How much did it cost? I said, I don't know. He said, well, I'll put up $50,000. Does that do it? He said, well, might do it. So J.C. Judge sold a bunch of gas stock he had to get enough money to pay for that lot. So then Harry Meredith contacted an architect to Simons over at Tyler, draw plans for a library, which he did. But it run more than the 50,000. He says, all right, whatever it is, I'll pay it. So we paid for the library. So that was in 1958. He had just organized the Meredith Foundation. So, but before he organized it, he was down talking to Ross Lookinville, a friend of his, that sold Irish Chrysler automobiles down on there, West Broad Street. There's a restaurant there now. So he was down talking to him, and he says, well, Ross, I've been thinking. I've outlived 3 wives, I don't have any children. What am I going to do with my money when I'm gone? What's going to happen? He said, well, I don't know. Why don't you do something for Mineola? Mineola's been good for you. Why don't you do something for Mineola? Well, I don't know. So a little while he left. About an hour he come back. He said, Ross, I've been thinking. He said, what's that? What you said? He said, what did I say? He said, do something for Mineola. He said, I've been talking to Harry Jones, and it was a local attorney, and he's doing all the legal work to set up a Meredith Foundation. And I want you to be one of my trustees. You all right? Whatever you want. All right, that's what I want. He named Joe Sharp as one of his trustees. A good friend of his. They played golf together. J.C. Judge, he brought that lot. Well, he named him as a trustee. He named Leonard Bruder, who was mayor of Mineola, to be the other trustee. That him and 4 others would form the Meredith Foundation. Each one of them then had to be appointed by the district judge, which that was done. So that was done with an indenture of trust. And in that indenture of trust, it says that the money from my foundation must be spent for the benefit of the people of Mineola. That's the way it's written. Then, of course, a lot of things come up. Anyhow, the city was going to give $200 a month to support the library because it was needed to the city. But we had a very limited city government. We had a mayor and 2 councilmen. That's all we had. So it says there's a little clause in there that had written in it that if we miss 3 consecutive payments of the $200, then we're no longer obligated to fund the library. So we'll lead it back to the library board. So that was done, and I was appointed at that time as a trustee of the Meredith Foundation, which I served 38 years. Last 25, I was chairman. At the meeting, and then come on the board, on the agenda, Mr. Bruder, the mayor, was still on the board, and Harry Jones had been appointed to the board. He said, Leonard, how did you let that clause get in there? He said, Harry, I was a mayor. We had 2 commissioners. I had 1 vote, they had 2 votes. They had that written in there by the attorney. Not Harry Jones, he was another attorney in Mineola that wrote that in there for him. So, the Meredith Foundation, then the library board had to become 501c3, a nonprofit organization,
Right.
so that they could accept the money from the Meredith Foundation to support the library, which it did. Well, that was the first act in there. So then they wanted to know what Mineola needed. And that's where all of the other things that come from the Meredith Foundation had to come from 501c3 organizations that are nonprofit, so they could share in Harry Meredith's indenture of trust to get money. Except for the school in the city, because they're of the type of entity that does not have to go through the 501c3. They're supported by the voters and taxes from Mineola citizens. But we could support the school in the city. Then we built this civic center, is one of the things. Meredith Foundation bought the grounds out there, 2 different tracts of ground, $38,000, $1,000 an acre. That's a lot of money then. We built the civic center that was $1 million, worth $5 million now. We still pay for the help maintain it because they can't make enough money out of rentals or make enough money out of renting the RV pads or whatever. So they need money to keep the doors open, so the foundation helps them. The Youth Foundation Park out there was bought. Built a number of ball fields, lighted all of them, built chain link fences, made bleachers.
And the money from this is, I take it, and I'm not sure how this is all set up, the Meredith Foundation has investments, and the income that it makes from its investments is the money that it puts into these projects.
Well,
is that right?
We were very fortunate to have a lot of oil money at first from
Right.
Hawkins Field. Then the Haynesville oil field was opened. We had a lot of money from that. Some other little holdings in various counties come in. So that money was then starting off, we started investing that money. And these investments have grown. And according to the Internal Revenue Service, the Meredith Foundation is obligated to give away 5% of its net worth every year. So
Okay.
that money comes in and is distributed among the several organizations that can receive the money. Then it also says, any other money coming in after you reach that figure must be invested to continue the life of the Meredith Foundation. So we have millions of dollars invested, which is paying off, been paying off. We keep it invested. We have certified public accountants that tell us what to do. We're empowered to hire CPAs, hire attorneys, hire whatever we need to maintain the operation of the Meredith Foundation.
So the Meredith Foundation's alive and well.
It is live and well.